Now, welcome to the Schilling Show. Bert Ellis, CEO and chairman of Ellis Capital, holding the same positions with KDOC TV in Los Angeles, which I used to watch when I lived there, and I love that station. Co-founder and president emeritus of a wonderful organization, the Jefferson Council, whom you hear on this program every month. A former member of the University of Virginia Board of Visitors, and so many more things, a double who in addition to all of that. Today's topic is righting the ship at UVA. It's a tall order. Bert Ellis, welcome to the Schilling Show.
Good afternoon, Rob. Great to be here.
All right. I want to start out with your love for the University of Virginia because I know you love this school, and I know it because I've interviewed you before, and I've kind of observed your actions over the years that we've known each other the past couple of years. But I think there's a misperception that you have some hostility or animosity towards it, and I think nothing could be further from the truth. So let's start there. Well,
I'd love to clarify that. I'm on the eve of my 50th reunion as a student here. I am a double who, as you said. I have served on the board of the Darden School for 3 terms. I've been on the board at the university, at the Board of Visitors for now 3 years. I have been coming back and forth as an athletic fan and a fan of this university for all those 50 years. About 5 years ago, with 16 other Wahoos, I purchased a place that I used to work called the White Spot to protect that little bit of history and legacy of our university and make sure it is here forever. Every little college town has got their little, college joint. Some of them have gone by the by, and it's such a shame. I don't want the White Spot to go. I love this place. I lived on the lawn for our 50th reunion. I've got my lawn room back. I'll see 25 to 30 of my fellow lawnies who have remained best friends for all those years.
You mentioned the lawn, and just as a general overview of the university, I want to talk to you about the slide, what I would call the slide, and you've seen a lot more of it than I have because you watch it more closely. But, I even knew some people that lived on the lawn, not while they were living there, but afterward, and it was such an honor. And I think this is one of the things that certainly got your attention was the disrespect of that privilege that people have been given and maybe indicative of a further slide of the university. What are you seeing?
I was very concerned about that. As you know, that was sort of the impetus to be appointed to the board. I had no idea it was going to lead to that. But my grandson and my daughter and son-in-law were walking down the lawn, some years ago, and my grandson, about 2 years old, they were, getting him ready to apply to UVA at an early age, and they walked down the lawn and saw the FK UVA sign taking up a whole lawn door and sent me a picture and said, Dad, listed on the lawn, what do you think? And, I thought that was horrible and sent a note to the president of the university, Jim Ryan, saying this is on a lawn door. Is this permitted? And my answer I got from him was, no, I'm on it. And I found out a week later when I came up here to see that sign that, no, I'm on it, meant, he was going to assign ambassadors to protect that lawn, that, awful lawn sign, which I objected to the profanity. It was not F.K. It was the whole
fill
word.
In the blanks, right?
I objected to the profanity. I objected to the message, and the way it was displayed. Yeah. I didn't object to the person's right to have that message. I wanted to disagree with said person on that lawn room, and I tried to have a conversation, with that person, and we had 2 or 3 sentences, and then she said, I object to you being here, and slammed the door in my face.
So that was kind of a flashpoint, if I could put it that way. But Bert, there had to be other things that you had observed over the years that were troubling you about the University of Virginia in a broad way. What other things were there as you've been watching this university since you were a part of it?
Well, the dramatic decline in the honor system, which I've lived my whole life on the basis that, I trust you until or unless you prove that I can't trust you. I don't start with a distrust. And that's a legacy of the honor system, which was very strong and active and supported and a part of our life 50 years ago when I was here. And
what happened in the intervening 50 years? Because I know even to the time when my wife was at the University of Virginia, was back in the early 2000s and getting her PhD there, that this was a very strong sentiment amongst people that you could trust each other and that you wouldn't violate that. So how did that all fall apart?
Well, that's very interesting, Rob, because right now I'm doing a little project. I ran PK German in the University Union when I was here, which is how I happened to get a lawn room. And so we booked all the concerts, and I wanted to go back and put together a list of all the concerts that were booked during my tenure and before and after. And to do that, the only way to do that was to go to the old Cavalier dailies and flip them page by page until I found the ads for PK German. In the process of doing that, I would read the headlines and stories, and there were many, many, many stories about the honor issues with the honor system, and so it just I had a chance to relive all that history, and Vietnam and all the other things that were happening back then. But the honor system, the Board of Visitors and the successive presidents declined over time to dramatically enforce the honor system. When we were here, every student was taken to, I believe it was U Hall, and we were given a fire and brimstone speech about the honor system. And one of the most memorable lines in there was, from Charlie Whitebread, I think was one of the the law professor that gave the most fire and brimstone was, look to your left and look to your right. If that person lies, cheats, and steals, they won't be here. But also, make sure they're looking left and right too. So you can't do it. But if he, she, you don't do it, then you have a community of honor that you can count on. And that was, a very integral part of orientation. And successive presidents and Board of Visitors just let that slide. And I've gone to the last 4 or 5 orientations, and I've made a point of getting to know the honor chairs to talk to them about it. Can this honor system be rejuvenated? Can it be saved? Does it exist? Do the students care about it? Is it just lip service? I have unfortunately come to the conclusion it is the latter. That it is, the students don't believe in it, and it is not presented to them in a way that this can change your life. It can make you different. If you take the honor system and the other things that I've been trying to protect out of this university, you have red brick. I did not go to this university because I liked the red brick.
This is disturbing to hear because it was such an important kind of a cornerstone or a backbone of the University of Virginia. If there was somebody in a position of leadership who wanted to revive the honor system as it was, would that be possible? What would be the process? What would it take?
It will take a concerted effort. When I was here, again back in the Ice Ages, there were posters. There was the honor pledge in every room, and there was a poster of some unique alumni saying that the honor system changed my life. And and a testimonial of how it was used. I was one of those posters for a while, but to bring it home, for orientation, you need to. I think the Board of Visitors and the president need to make it a very, very big part of orientation multiple times, and you need to bring in people that the students can relate to. Younger, better, famous, better, whatever. Somebody they can relate to that can say how the honor system, changed their life and made them unique. UVA has a chance to be that light on the hill. It has a chance to be unique. It has been. I want it to continue. And the honor system was an underpinning to all that. That was something that, the military academies had. A few other schools had, W&L and others that really pushed it. But UVA, I think, had the best one. And we've let it slide. But it's not gone, but it is teetering.
I wanted to talk before we go to the break. We got about 3 minutes here. We're talking with Bert Ellis, and we'll be with him for the rest of the hour. I wanted to talk about the Jefferson Council. I have such high regard for this organization. You are a co-founder. Would you tell us about the Jefferson Council and its influence over the past several years?
Well, the FK UVA sign was instigated that too. After my experience with that, and there are folks that say I came up there and attacked the woman in the lawn room with a razor blade, which is total bogus. I did have a window scraper in my pocket, and if nobody had been home, I was probably going to take the sign down myself. There was somebody home, and so we had a discussion, and I left it there. But the university then determined that in spite of the lease that that occupant of the lawn signs and other things, they decided they could not take the sign down, could not or would not. So I started writing letters, and just viral letters and sent them out to my friends. That, did you know this is on the lawn? What do you think? And then started delineating a number of other things that I was very, very concerned about at the university, and sent them out to friends, and friends sent them to friends and friends and friends and friends. And in the process, myself and Tom Neal decided there needed to be an organization that represented that point of view back to a very leftist organization, otherwise known as the faculty and administration of this university. So how to do that? Put together an organization of like-minded folks that cared about Mr. Jefferson's legacy, the honor system, freedom of speech, and diversity of thought. And we thought that needed to be yelled from the rooftops. So we created the Jefferson Council to do that. And that organization is now got several hundred active members and more that are occasional, donors at all. So we have and we're trying to make sure that voice is heard.
We've got about a minute left until the break, and the Jefferson Council has been an important voice. Just to characterize the ability of them to have an effect on UVA, I mean, what do you think has been the greatest success of the Jefferson Council in our remaining minute?
Well, I would say we think the greatest success was getting me appointed to the board.
Yes.
And so that was a push that we did. And then when I got appointed to the board, the governor asked me to step aside from the Jefferson Council and turn the reins over to Tom Neal and now to Joel Gardner, so I could be detached from that to a certain degree. No one ever expected me to disavow the Jefferson Council, but when the governor asked me to do that, I stepped aside. I didn't just fake it.
Right.
I stepped aside and let Tom and Joel run it. But they have created a voice for the folks that believe in the university as we attended it many years ago.
We're talking with Bert Ellis, a former member of the UVA Board of Visitors. We come back on the other side. We're going to talk about his board service and some of the things that transpired during that time. All right, the Schilling Show continues on this Wild Wednesday edition of the program. Our exclusive in-studio guest is Bert Ellis, among many other things, a former member of the University of Virginia Board of Visitors, and we're talking about his experience leading up to that, and now we're going to talk about his time on the board. So let's talk about you getting onto the board, how it actually came about, and what your expectation was going in as to what sort of an agent you would be in that position.
Well, the first thing that happened was, Glenn Youngkin was elected governor, which was quite a surprise to a lot of people, including Terry McAuliffe. So Glenn, as a Republican governor, and as any governor, you got to appoint the board. The governor appoints the board. The governor serves one term, as everyone in Virginia knows, but over the course of that term, he or she gets to appoint the board members for all the public universities, a lot of other boards, but all the public universities we'll talk about, of which I think UVA is the premier of those in this state. He gets to appoint the board members over a 4-year period, so it's a staggered appointments. in the university, but Virginia, the Board of Visitors has 17 voting members, and he appoints them 4-4-5-4-4 or 4-4-5-4 to get to 17. And so when he was inaugurated and started putting together his appointees was on the heels of the FK UVA sign and putting together the Jefferson Council and my viral letters, and his advisors recommended to him that he appoint some activists to start the process to change the University of Virginia. So I was one of his first 4 appointees, and the challenge that I got, and one of my other fellow appointees got the same speech from the governor, was, I'm putting you on the board. I want you to rattle cages. I want you to take the beach and hold the beach for reinforcements until we have enough that we can blow the enemy off.
That is a very clear directive as I'm hearing it. It's not ambiguous.
There was not ambiguous at all. It was, take and hold the beach. It wasn't, sneak ashore and say, pretty please, can I have a spot on your beach? Take and hold the beach.
Yeah.
And it took us until, our third year, our term, to really have enough reinforcements that we had sufficient votes to make changes. The first year we had 4 out of 17. The second year we had 8 out of 17, which is still not a majority, as everybody can do that math. Yeah. And now we have 13. It's now a they, but they have 13, and it takes 9 to make many changes. It takes a supermajority of 12 to make some changes, including changing the president.
Okay.
And so, and then once we had the supermajority, then it, was my conclusion that we had the reinforcements now to blow the enemy off. I'm a wholehearted supporter of my fellow board members, or my former fellow board members. I'm a supporter of the governor. I disagree on why he chose to terminate my position on the board, but the governor and I agree on the mission. We disagree on how to implement the mission, and the mission to me is, if you're going to fix this university, the only way to fix it is to get rid of the president. He's driving this thing hard left, and if we want to move it towards the middle, don't go there.
Well, that was very clear from any observer, and certainly you, Bert Ellis, being on the inside, saw more than most people did. So why could that not be agreed upon? In other words, what was the tipping point for the governor to say, after giving you this directive to take the beach and take control of the university, that all of a sudden that your style wasn't correct? I mean, I don't understand the dichotomy.
Well, I don't understand it either,
okay.
Rob. And I don't think you can make changes with an ingrained administration and faculty that want to stay hard left by saying pretty please. I think you have to put your foot down, and I think you can do that politely. I don't use profanity. I don't single out people. I don't dress people down in public. I will address the issue in public, but and I'm firm, and I stand my ground. But the governor thinks my style was caustic, and the governor made an analogy to me that he thinks that we no longer need the Marines on the beach. It's time to bring in the Army. And I argued with him. I said, I think I respectfully disagree with you totally, Governor. I think we, the Marines, if that's how you want to, the analogy for me, we own a very small sliver of the beach. And now we have enough troops to maybe get off that sliver, but some lieutenant's got to pop his head up over the berm and say, let's go. I was willing to do that. Now, once you do that, you got to go. And he doesn't think that is he doesn't think that's the Virginia gentleman style. And so we disagreed on style, and he thought I was not following his directives. And so we didn't agree to disagree. We just disagreed. And he's the governor and I'm not. So he terminated me.
So you certainly had a position. The way I looked at it as an outsider was you were tip of the spear. You were the change agent. You were the guy who was willing to say the tough things, the honest things, in as you said, a respectful way, but you weren't pulling any punches. So now that that position is gone, I mean, how do they expect to make the sort of institutional change that you were enacted to put into play?
That I hope it will happen, but there's no such thing as a board. You know, the board doesn't do something. The people on the board do something and then get their colleagues to vote with them. You got to have at least 9 and sometimes 12 of your 13, or when the governor has 17, it might be easier. But you still got to get them to go. So somebody's got to lead the charge. And, you know, I've devoted 10 days a month since I was on the board to being here in Charlottesville. I do not think you can be a Board of Visitors member and, you know, chopper in, you know, 2 days, 4 times a year. And all you're going to do is get spoon-fed by, you know, the administration, what they want you to hear, with no time to have any serious discussions and have a couple of cocktails and a couple of, you know, lunches and dinners and get out of here.
Is that what's happening? And I'm not asking you to call any names, but I mean, are there board members who are operating under that model? Clearly you are not.
Well, you know, some board members, none of the board members, with the exceptions of the folks that do live here in town,
right,
you know, spend as much time as I do. No aspersion on them. I said I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
I really want to fix this university, and you can't fix this university if you don't know how the university operates or doesn't. And part of that's management by walking around. So I use my time. I've been into every academic building. I've met with bunches of professors. I've met with students. I've met with the head of the honor system, Judish, you name it. I've met with students that are, you know, that are in Hillel and Shabbat, you know, to ask them, you know, is the anti-Semitism as much as I think it is? And, you know, and I've spent time. We've done the Jefferson Council. We've had the students at the, you know, the White Spot, so we get to hear their point of view. And so one of the roles I took on, and, you know, on behalf of my fellow board members, was to be the whip, you know, and the rules of public meetings in the state, you know, and we're not unique, but no more than a board member cannot talk to any more than one board member at a time.
No more than 2. Right.
Two on the phone.
Two at a time.
2
right.
total.
Right.
You can't talk to 2 more.
Right. 2 total at any one given time.
Without you know, that being a public meeting, which means 5 days notice, and the press has to be invited. Now you can wink, wink, nod, nod, and violate that, but, you know, I knew I couldn't. You know, the world was looking for a chance to, you know, nail me. So to do anything, you know, would require maybe 25 phone calls of our 13 or 17 board members. There were some of the northern appointees that, you know, that I could work with, you know, quite well. But you had to go around, and you couldn't just say we're going to do X, Y, and Z. When, you know, after the first phone call, somebody said, well, maybe we ought to add, you know, C or D into that.
And then you're back.
And then you had to go back around. And then you had to do a whip count. Do you have the votes or not? You know, so that was one of the roles I took on. And somebody else is going to have to do it. There are players on the board that will do it. And there were about 5 or 6 of us that were totally simpatico on the mission, you know, and the pressure that we would put on the administration to change. So it just wasn't, you know, but by no means was, you know, I the only one, you know, but there were times where I was more outspoken than my colleagues. But I wasn't the sole activist.
We're talking with Bert Ellis, and we're talking about his time on the Board of Visitors and what comes next. We have 1 segment left and so many more questions. The Schilling Show with Bert Ellis continues in just a moment. The Schilling Show continues. This exclusive interview with Bert Ellis, former member of the Board of Visitors at the University of Virginia, and such important information. I'm really grateful for Bert coming in today. And I know so many of you wanted to hear from him in his own voice, which we've had this extended time together. So let's look at the future and maybe the present and how things could change to affect the future, because I think in some ways people like to think about running the clock down. In other words, when Youngkin's term expires, then we start getting the other people back and we just go back to how it was. I think that would be a disaster. So what's the game plan as you see it?
Well, first, I disagree with the governor. He thinks we will have 3 more years of total control of the board. I disagree. If there's going to be an election November 4th. I hope Winsome Sears will win.
Yes.
I have written her the maximum check I could write, and I'm a big supporter, but can't count on that yet.
That's right.
And if presumably Abby Spanberger, prevails and wins, she can change out the whole board. The governor said she can't, but the governor terminated me for violation of code of conduct, which is bogus in my view. But it's
there's a lot of latitude there. In other words, a governor could come in and come up with reasons that would be acceptable under that broad definition.
Yeah, according to the rules of board memberships, you can terminate a board member for malfeasance, misfeasance, incompetence, or dereliction of duty. I didn't do any of those, but it's all at the interpretation of the governor.
Okay.
So the governor decided I was in violation of code of conduct. I was too caustic. Now the next governor could do that too. So, but the next governor is not going to be inaugurated until second week of January.
So we got a little
count
time.
that out with your fingers. You got 9 months.
Okay.
So you got my view, and part of my effort to really accelerate what we were doing, and ran afoul of the governor because of my style, was we have 9 months to get everything done we possibly can, and do it in such a way that would be very hard to reverse. So, and number one on my list was you have to change the management of the university. We got a management that's driving hard left. The governor, the board, my fellow board members wanted to move the university back towards the middle. We had no notion that we were going to turn this thing into Hillsdale, but move it towards the middle so diversity of thought would be acceptable.
Yes.
Not a total change of thought, but, the acceptance of such.
That's right.
So you got to change that because, this administration's driving hard left. They're going to give lip service. They're going to move the cheese around. But, our board voted affirmatively to terminate DEI. It has not been terminated, and it took almost 2 weeks to even take the website down. None of the administrators that were doing it are done. None of the programs that we're doing. And DEI, when it was initially invented, I think it had very positive notions. It got perverted along the way. It has not moved the needle at all to do anything for the folks that it's theoretically supposed to advantage, and it has only created more divisiveness in this university. Which, when we were here, we were all wahoos. We weren't worried about all the any other divisions. We wanted to be wahoos. We wanted an honor system. We wanted to be wahoos. That's what I want. But that didn't. We passed unanimously a resolution to eliminate the gender mutilation and at the hospital. The other side wants to call it gender affirmative care.
We know that's a lie.
I don't want them to win the narrative on that. It's
that's
not.
Right.
But we're not doing it. I mean, right now, basically the University of Virginia health system says, we're open for puberty blockers and hormonal treatments if you want it. But we're still open for business.
So this calls to question the resolve of the board. Clearly, you're not there anymore. But why doesn't the board assert themselves if they believe strongly in that? Let's just take that one example, that we need to stop the mutilation. We need to stop it now, or a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. And that's just the way it is. I mean, why don't we hear that?
Well, I think this board will, but the board passed the resolution that said, Jim Ryan, implement it. And Jim Ryan, basically said pound sand. You can see, he went to the faculty meeting, 3 or 4 days later, and you can see the video of the faculty meeting. He said, we're not going to do that. And the faculty, which is even harder left than Higgy, they not only said, don't do that, they said, go even farther left. And so you've got We got 3,300 faculty members here. I can name the conservative and or moderate. There's not many conservatives. Ken Elzinga. Okay, I named him. How many moderates are there? There's 9 others. That's it. That's it.
And I'm going to imagine most of them keep their heads down. I mean, Ken, we know, but the rest of them, I've heard from some who don't want to peep. They don't want to say a word because of what will happen if they do.
Right. So there's peer pressure to be hard left. And then, that's what they're teaching. We've gone away from being an educational institution to being an indoctrination institution, which I think is fixable. But you can only fix it if you change out the 2 most important positions are the provost and the president.
Okay.
The provost, fortunately, Ian Bauckham got hired away by an even more liberal institution. God bless them up in Vermont.
They did us a favor.
They did us a huge favor. But we this board, not me on it, but I still am highly supportive. This board, the mission, we all agreed on the mission. It's how to get there. I wanted to either call for the resignation or fire the president or just get him to resign by making so many changes that weren't palatable to Jim Ryan.
This is interesting, and I want to call back some history because we were here on the air when Teresa Sullivan was forced out and then welcomed back in, and you had mentioned earlier about making changes that are hard to undo. So, I mean, it would seem to me that there would be a lot of strategy involved, but also there would be a lot of determination required from those making that decision.
Yeah, and everybody on the board knows very well what happened with the Teresa Sullivan.
Mm-hmm.
The board made a move, and then they lost their nerve, and they undid their move.
Yeah.
And, nobody on this board wants to do that. They don't want to replicate that. So, they perhaps want to be more careful. Yeah, and you have to make sure you have the votes, and you have to make sure your votes will stay because there's going to be, you make that kind of change at any university, but at this university with this faculty, that's hard left, there's going to be a backlash. You've got to be prepared for it. I was prepared for it. I think a number of my board members, fellow board members are prepared for it. Is everybody? Are 12 of them prepared for it? You can't do it until you are. And that's what the whip's got to do. So somebody's got to be the whip, and it won't be me. Somebody else has got to do that. But you can't just show up at a meeting and have 13 people looking around the room going, "Who's going to talk? Who's going first? What are we going to do?" Those have to be orchestrated, and that takes a boatload of phone calls.
We've got just about a minute or two left, Bert Ellis. So what advice do you have for your fellow board members? Nobody specifically. There's a new one coming on, but there's others that you have worked with over the past 3 years. If you were to give them direction now from the outside in, what do you say to them?
The number one easiest, bestest thing they can do for this university is to cut the costs, to pull a full Doge. This university's budget is $5.8 billion. I think you could easily take $500 million out of this budget. 1% of $5.8 billion is $58 million. 10% is $580 million. There was no company, any of my fellow businessmen or women know that you can cut up to 20% of the budget of a company and not hit bone. Can't do it every year, but you can do it, every now and then, which has never been done here. If you took $500 million out of this budget, which should be easy, you'd get rid of all the stupid stuff in the process, but you could cut tuition for the parents, and the kids that are coming here. Every $100 million would cut tuition by $5,000 a year.
That's significant.
And if you took the tuition down at this university $10,000, you would have this this state loving you. As a governor, as a politician, as an administrator, as a board, and we could do that, and we should, and probably more. But, we have so many things. I mean, at this university, there are 7 political departments. You have the Department of Politics, you have Center for Politics, you got the Batten Institute, you got the Karsh Institute. There's 7 of them. Nobody that I've ever talked to can tell you what's the difference. But why do we have to have 7? The Center for Politics was the first grandbaby with Larry Sabato. That one, I don't think we need any of the others.
Yeah.
And those are big savings. They all have facilities. They all have buildings. They all have staff. You don't need those, and you can go throughout this university and find stuff like that. But cutting tuition, cutting the cost of this university, and moving it towards the center, that's what this board can and should do, and I'm going to support them in every way I can.
What a gift to future generations that would be, and for this board to accomplish that over the next 9 months would be absolutely remarkable, and really be a signal to other boards across the nation that they could do the same thing. I think it would be fantastic. Bert Ellis, it's been a wonderful time having you here in the studio with us today on the Schilling Show. Thank you for your work at the University of Virginia and your ongoing efforts, and we have much more to talk about next time.
You bet. Thanks, Rob.
You.